Darkness doesn't always arrive wearing a mask. Sometimes it shakes your hand, sometimes it smiles, asks about your family, and trims your hedges before driving away. For years, that's exactly how people in Toronto saw Bruce McArthur, a quiet landscaper with a friendly personality and a reputation for hard work. He blended into the background so completely that almost no one imagined he was hiding one of Canada's darkest secrets. But behind that ordinary appearance was a man who would leave families searching for answers, a community living in fear, and investigators racing against time before another person disappeared. When police finally uncovered the truth, even seasoned detectives struggled to process what they were seeing. The discovery wasn't just shocking. It rewrote everything they thought they knew about a series of missing persons cases that had haunted Toronto for years. If you enjoy well-researched true crime documentaries that focus on facts instead of sensationalism, make sure you're subscribed. Every week, we uncover real cases that remind us truth can be far more disturbing than fiction. Long before his name made international headlines, Bruce McArthur lived what appeared to be an ordinary life. Born in Ontario in 1951, he spent years building a reputation as someone who enjoyed gardening and landscaping. Friends and acquaintances often described him as approachable and easy to talk to. He had children, had been married, and later became involved in Toronto's LGBTQ+ community after his marriage ended. On the surface, there was nothing that immediately suggested danger. That ordinary image would become one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Toronto is one of Canada's largest and safest cities, known for its diversity and vibrant neighborhoods. Among them is the Church Wellesley Village, commonly known as the Gay Village, a place filled with restaurants, bars, festivals, and a strong sense of community. It was here that many people felt free to be themselves. It was also here that several men would mysteriously vanish. At first, each disappearance seemed like an isolated tragedy. Adults disappear for many reasons. Some choose to leave. Others struggle with mental health or addiction. Sometimes they return home days later. Because of that reality, missing person investigations often begin with uncertainty. But as the years passed, something about these disappearances began to trouble both loved ones and members of the community. One man would suddenly stop answering his phone. Another would miss work without explanation. Family members who spoke to them every day found themselves hearing only silence. Friends searched hospitals, called shelters, and checked every place they could think of. Nothing. No phone calls, no confirmed sightings, no explanation. Each disappearance left behind the same haunting question: where did they go? Many of the missing men shared similarities. Several had connections to Toronto's Gay Village. Some were newcomers to Canada. Others had families living thousands of miles away. A few had limited support networks, making it even harder for anyone to notice immediately when they vanished. To those who loved them, every passing day without answers became unbearable. As months turned into years, rumors spread throughout the neighborhood. Some believed a serial killer was operating in the city. Others argued there wasn't enough evidence to support such a terrifying conclusion. Police publicly urged caution, explaining that investigations require evidence, not assumptions. But fear doesn't wait for evidence. Fear grows in uncertainty. People started changing their routines. Some avoided walking alone late at night. Friends insisted on checking in with each other after evenings out. Conversations inside local cafes and bars increasingly returned to the same unsettling topic. Could these disappearances really be connected? Investigators worked through countless leads. They examined financial records, phone activity, travel histories, surveillance footage, witness interviews. Every missing person created another maze of possibilities, and every dead end only deepened the mystery. Then another man disappeared, and then another. Families found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of hope and heartbreak. Every unknown phone number sparked optimism. Every knock at the door raised expectations. Every day that ended without answers made accepting the worst a little more likely. What made the investigation especially difficult was the lack of obvious crime scenes. Without physical evidence, detectives faced enormous challenges. Missing persons cases often depend on tiny details. One overlooked receipt, one forgotten message, one witness remembering something unusual weeks later. Sometimes those details never appear. Meanwhile, life across Toronto continued. Construction crews built new buildings, businesses opened and closed, festivals filled the streets with music and laughter. Yet somewhere within that same city, the person responsible for these disappearances appeared to be living an ordinary life. That's often the most unsettling reality about serial offenders. They rarely look like the monsters people imagine. Instead, they become experts at appearing normal. Bruce McArthur had spent years working as a self-employed landscaper. His job allowed him to travel between properties, meet new clients, and spend hours working outdoors without attracting attention. Gardening requires patience, planning, precision. Those same qualities can become terrifying when used for darker purposes. As investigators revisited old files, they noticed patterns that had once seemed insignificant. Individual pieces of information, meaningless on their own, slowly began fitting together like fragments of a much larger puzzle. One witness remembered seeing a missing man with someone older. Another recalled a vehicle. Digital evidence revealed connections that investigators hadn't fully appreciated years earlier. Modern forensic technology also continued improving, allowing detectives to re-examine evidence with fresh eyes. Bit by bit, the picture became clearer. The possibility that Toronto had been facing a serial killer was becoming harder to dismiss. Still, detectives knew they couldn't act on suspicion alone. They needed evidence strong enough to survive in court, evidence that would finally answer the question families had been asking for years: what happened to our loved ones? That answer was closer than anyone realized, and when investigators finally uncovered it, the truth would become one of the most horrifying discoveries in Canadian criminal history. For years, investigators carried the weight of unanswered questions. Every missing persons file represented someone whose life had simply stopped without explanation. Families couldn't move forward because they didn't know whether to grieve or keep hoping. Detectives couldn't close their investigations because there was never enough evidence to prove what had happened. The uncertainty lingered over Toronto like a storm that refused to pass. By 2017, that pressure was growing. Members of Toronto's LGBTQ+ community had become increasingly vocal, arguing that too many men had disappeared under similar circumstances for the cases to be treated as unrelated. Public meetings were held. Community leaders demanded answers. Police faced mounting criticism over whether the disappearances had been connected sooner. Behind the scenes, investigators continued comparing timelines, phone records, financial activity, and witness statements. Individually, the files were frustrating. Together, they began revealing patterns that couldn't be ignored. One name kept surfacing: Bruce McArthur. He wasn't an obvious suspect at first glance. He was in his 60s, worked as a landscaper, and was well known to many people. He had clients across Toronto, particularly in neighborhoods filled with large homes and carefully maintained gardens. His work allowed him to come and go throughout the city without attracting attention. More importantly, he was active in the same community where several of the missing men had last been seen. Investigators quietly began taking a closer look. They reviewed his movements. They examined his digital activity. They searched for links between him and the missing men. The more they looked, the more concerning those connections became. One of the most significant breakthroughs came through digital evidence. Investigators were able to establish contact between McArthur and some of the missing men before they vanished. It wasn't enough to prove murder, but it was enough to justify closer surveillance. Without alerting him, officers began watching his movements. Day after day, surveillance teams followed him across Toronto. It was painstaking work. Detectives knew that if Bruce McArthur realized he was being watched, months of investigative effort could collapse overnight. Every vehicle had to blend into traffic. Every officer had to avoid being noticed. Meanwhile, McArthur carried on with what appeared to be his normal routine. He visited clients. He purchased landscaping supplies. He attended social events. Nothing about his daily life suggested that investigators believed he might be connected to multiple disappearances. Then came January 2018. It would become the turning point in the entire investigation. Police believed another man was in immediate danger. According to court records, investigators feared McArthur might be preparing to kill again. That possibility changed everything. Instead of continuing surveillance indefinitely, they made the decision to intervene. On January 18, 2018, officers arrested Bruce McArthur. For the public, the announcement was shocking. For the families of the missing men, it was the first real sign that answers might finally be coming. But an arrest alone wasn't enough. detectives still needed physical evidence. Without it, proving multiple murders beyond a reasonable doubt would be incredibly difficult. Soon after the arrest, search warrants were executed at locations connected to McArthur. Investigators entered his apartment. Forensic specialists documented everything. Every room, every electronic device, every photograph, every personal belonging. Nothing was considered too small to examine. As they searched, officers recovered evidence that strengthened their belief they had identified the person responsible for years of disappearances. But detectives also knew McArthur had worked on numerous properties throughout Toronto as a landscaper. Those properties suddenly became part of the investigation. Teams began identifying locations where he had completed landscaping work over the years. Some homeowners had no idea that the man who had designed or maintained their gardens was now at the center of Canada's largest serial murder investigation in decades. One property in particular would become critically important. It belonged to a client who had allowed McArthur to store landscaping materials there. What investigators discovered during their search would horrify the country. Before we continue, if you're finding this documentary informative, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It helps us continue producing carefully researched, true crime stories that focus on verified facts and the people whose lives were forever changed. As forensic teams prepared to examine the property, no one could have predicted the scale of what they were about to uncover. The search would not only confirm investigators' worst fears, it would reveal a truth even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The property looked ordinary. It was the kind of place people walked past every day without giving it a second thought. Mature trees surrounded the backyard. Large decorative planters sat neatly arranged around the garden, blending naturally into the carefully landscaped space. To anyone passing by, they were simply part of the scenery, but forensic investigators had learned long ago that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Every inch of the property was examined with extraordinary care. Officers photographed the grounds, mapped the layout, and began a methodical search. Hours turned into days as forensic specialists worked through the evidence, knowing that one overlooked detail could mean the difference between solving years of disappearances or leaving families without answers once again. Then came the discovery. Inside one of the large planters, investigators found human remains. The scene fell silent. Even experienced detectives, many of whom had spent decades investigating violent crimes, understood immediately that this was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was something far worse. As additional planters were searched, more human remains were recovered. One after another, investigators uncovered evidence that confirmed their worst fears. The landscaping containers that had decorated the property for years had concealed a horrifying secret. The discovery sent shockwaves across Canada. News spread rapidly. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers carried the story across their front pages. International media descended on Toronto as details slowly emerged. Families who had spent years searching for loved ones watched every update with mixed emotions. Some desperately hoped the remains would not belong to their family member. Others quietly feared they finally knew the answer they had dreaded for years. Identifying the victims was an enormous forensic challenge. Because the remains had been concealed for extended periods, specialists relied on DNA analysis, dental records, and other scientific methods to establish each person's identity. The work required patience, precision, and compassion. One by one, the victims were identified. Among them were men whose disappearances had haunted Toronto for years. Some had come to Canada seeking a better life. Some had families overseas who had waited endlessly for news. Others had built lives within Toronto's LGBTQ+ community, surrounded by friends who never stopped searching for them. Each identification brought a measure of closure, but also immense heartbreak. These were no longer names on missing person posters. They were fathers, brothers, sons, friends, people whose futures had been stolen. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they concluded that Bruce McArthur had targeted vulnerable men over several years. Many of the victims were connected to Toronto's gay village and had crossed paths with him before disappearing. Court records showed that he used dating and social interactions to meet some of his victims before luring them to private locations. The realization was chilling. For years, he had hidden in plain sight. He attended community events, worked for clients, held conversations with neighbors, all while investigators searched for people who would never return home. Detectives continued examining digital evidence recovered after his arrest. Computers, phones, and storage devices revealed further information that helped investigators reconstruct parts of the victim's final known movements. Each new piece of evidence strengthened the case and helped establish the connections prosecutors would later present in court. As the investigation expanded, police also searched additional properties linked to McArthur's landscaping business. Although the most significant discoveries had already been made, investigators wanted to ensure no evidence was overlooked. The scale of the operation became one of the largest homicide investigations in Toronto's history. Dozens of detectives, forensic anthropologists, DNA specialists, crime scene analysts, every resource available was dedicated to uncovering the truth. Meanwhile, public scrutiny intensified. Many people questioned whether opportunities had been missed years earlier. Could these murders have been stopped sooner? Should the disappearances have been connected earlier? Those questions would become the focus of independent reviews long after the criminal case concluded. But before those answers could be explored, there was one final step. Bruce McArthur would have to face justice in court. For the families, it wasn't about revenge. It was about hearing the truth acknowledged in a courtroom. It was about ensuring the victims would never again be reduced to statistics. And it was about making certain the man responsible could never harm another person again. The courtroom was filled with emotions that had been building for years. Some family members carried photographs of the men they had lost. Others sat quietly, holding each other's hands, preparing to hear details they had spent years fearing were true. Detectives who had dedicated countless hours to the investigation took their seats, knowing this was the moment every piece of evidence had been leading toward. Bruce McArthur entered the courtroom without the appearance many people expect from someone responsible for such horrific crimes. He looked like an ordinary elderly man. That was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire case. There was nothing about his appearance that reflected the devastation he had left behind. In January 2019, Bruce McArthur pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. By pleading guilty, he spared the victims' families from a lengthy trial, but it also meant many questions about his motives would never be fully answered. The court heard the names of the 8 men whose lives had been taken: Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, Majid Kaihan, Dean Lisowick, Sarosh Mahmoodi, Salim Eason, Andrew Kinsman, Karushna Kumar Kanagaratnam. As each name was read aloud, it served as a reminder that this case was never just about a serial killer. It was about 8 human beings whose futures had been stolen. The court sentenced Bruce McArthur to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence available under Canadian law at the time. The judge described the murders as pure evil, reflecting the profound harm done to the victims, their families, and the wider community. For many relatives, however, no sentence could truly bring closure. A prison term could punish the offender. It could not restore birthdays that would never be celebrated, phone calls that would never be answered, or the years families spent hoping against hope that their loved one might still walk through the front door. The investigation also prompted difficult conversations across Canada. An independent review examined how police had handled the earlier disappearances and whether warning signs had been missed. Community members questioned whether the victims' backgrounds and the fact that many were connected to Toronto's LGBTQ+ community had affected the urgency of the investigations. Those reviews led to recommendations aimed at improving communication with vulnerable communities, strengthening missing person investigations, and ensuring future cases receive the attention they deserve. While those changes cannot undo the past, they represent an effort to learn from it. Bruce McArthur is now serving his sentence in a Canadian federal prison. His name will likely remain in criminal history for decades, but history should remember something even more important. It should remember the victims. Too often, serial killers become the focus of documentaries while the people they harmed are reduced to brief mentions. That isn't how this story should end. Andrew Kinsman was known for his generosity and his sense of humor. Salim Eason had friends who never stopped searching for him. Abdulbasir Faizi's family spent years waiting for answers. Each victim had dreams, relationships, and people who loved them deeply. Their lives mattered long before they became part of a criminal investigation. Cases like this also remind us of an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always fit the image people expect. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary routines, familiar faces, and everyday conversations. That's why investigations depend on persistence, science, and the determination of people who refuse to let victims be forgotten. In the end, it wasn't luck that uncovered the truth. It was years of painstaking police work, advances in forensic science, and the relentless determination of families and a community that refused to stop asking questions. Their persistence ensured that the missing were finally found, their identities restored, and the man responsible held accountable. Thank you for watching. If this documentary helped you better understand this case, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories. We focus on the facts, honor the victims, and explore the investigations that brought long-hidden truths to light. And before you leave, take a moment to remember the 8 men whose lives were stolen. Behind every headline was a person with hopes, loved ones, and a future that should never have been taken away. Because in the end, the most important names in this story were never those of the killer. They were the names of the victims,